So I get a lot of this information from different heroes of mine. The hero that I want to give credit to is Dr. Ted Naiman. I'm going to have a quiz at the end, and I have put up a few questions to get you all involved. So if you're eating carbohydrates and fat in the same meal, what does your body have to burn first? What is the cleanest burning fuel that will not damage the engine of your body? So in other words, our body has an engine which is called the mitochondria. We are going to get into the mitochondria in a little bit detail in this presentation. And I put different kinds of sugar because somebody will ask me, hey, brown sugar is better than regular sugar, or honey is better than regular sugar. So I put all kinds of sugars out there. And then fruits. And then what many people think is very bad, which is lard and fat from fatty meat. So what is the cleanest burning fuel? So most of you know the answer, but I want you to understand why. And if you understand why, you will make better choices. If your body is burning mostly carbohydrates, does it damage the engine of your body? In other words, that is the mitochondria or our internal engine. So here is a healthy mitochondria that's full of fire and burning. That one is kind of damped out. It's not capable of burning any fuel. So is there any evidence that eating a lot of carbs and sugar damages the engine of your body? So you're eating sugary fruits and vegetables, sugars and grains, along with vegetable oil. So if you put grains and sugar together, you get a donut. And that's sugary fruit. We say that you'd go from a healthy mitochondria to damaged mitochondria. Okay, so we said that a substrate like sugar drives the kind of fuel that you will burn. So when I use sugar, I'm also saying carbohydrates. So if you're eating a bunch of carbohydrates, and even if they are very good carbohydrates, if you say, I'm going to go home and be on a very good fruit diet, which is blueberries, blackberries, raspberries, and I'm going to eat a whole bunch of them, okay? So it gets into the engine of the body, which is the mitochondria out there, and that mitochondria turns the fuel that you are using into energy. And the energy that it makes is called ATP. So our body is very good at making energy in the form of energy currency, which is called ATP. Here is a depiction of ATP, and I'm kind of just putting that out as energy. So at any given time, we have only 6 seconds of energy left because we are constantly producing energy. In fact, if you have a 70-kilogram man, and you see the amount of ATP that person produces in terms of their body weight, you would be shocked to know that it is 70 kilograms. Isn't that amazing? So we produce the entire weight of our body in energy every day in the form of ATP. The total amount of sugar that our body can store in our bloodstream, we have 5 liters of blood. The total amount of sugar in our bloodstream is only 1 teaspoon, 5 grams. That's it, no more. So would it shock you to say that the total carbs that we can store is only about 100 grams? That is 1/4 of a pound. And that's in the liver out there. If you stop eating, and if your body is only used to burning carbohydrates, it takes less than 6 hours for you to burn through that glycogen, and you would feel hungry again if you don't know how to burn fat. Okay, so that's an important point. The total amount of carbs that we can store is only 100 grams, 1/4 of a pound, the useful carb that's there in the liver. But let's say all the energy demands are met. What will you do with the carbs next? You will store some of it. Let's say your liver is full of glycogen. You can't store that carb anymore. Can you just leave it hanging in the bloodstream? No, you can't.
No.
What you do is that it gets converted from sugar, it gets converted to citrate, and from citrate it gets converted to this compound, malonyl-CoA. And malonyl-CoA does something very special. So what it does is that it comes down here and tells the body, hey, malonyl-CoA is going to block the entry of fat into the mitochondria for burning.
Wow.
So if you eat too much carbs, you're not going to be able to burn fat because the biochemical machinery in your cell is going to make this compound that comes and tells the mitochondria, you cannot take any fat for burning. So that's an important point. What does the body do with malonyl-CoA apart from preventing the entry of fat into the mitochondria? What it does is that it gets converted to fat and it gets stored in the fat cells, and the fat cells that are small in size will then get filled up with fat. So you get fat cell hypertrophy, your fat cells expand. What does the standard American eat these days? 60% of calories for standard Americans come from grains and vegetable oils and sugar. So if you take any average American, 60% of their calories are coming from this trifecta of sugar, grains, and vegetable oil. And we are not really eating whole grain. We're really eating refined grain most of the time. So here it is, grain, added sugar, and plant oils, that is 60% of the calories, and that is the amount of carbohydrates we eat in a standard American diet. That's the amount of protein, and that's the amount of fat. So we are a nation of what we call as carboholics. So this is a diagram that I have put up here to show you the fat reservoir. In a standard American, we have about 62 lbs of fat, 62 pounds of fat, but there's a lot of room to expand. On the other hand, the carbohydrate reservoir is 200 times smaller. It's only about 100 grams or 1/4 of a pound. This is the large capacity fat tank, which is 200 times greater than the carbohydrate tank shown out here. And in a person who is on a mixed diet, who is exercising, who's not eating too much, who is healthy, they are burning both fat. Here is the burning of fat, and here is the burning of carbohydrates. What I want to show you is that the carbohydrate tank is of very limited capacity, and if somebody is starting to eat more carbohydrates, suddenly what's happening is that you're not burning fat anymore. You can see out here that the yellow fat is not burnt at all. By obligate design, the sugar and carbohydrate is going to drive its burning, and you are going to leave the fat alone and burn carbohydrates. On the other hand, if the person is eating carbohydrates, the body has to burn the carbs first before it can burn fat. And if you start eating much more carbohydrates than you can burn, it's going to spill over and it's going to get converted to fat, and you're going to increase the size of your fat tank. So the fat that you ate will be stored. It will not be burnt at all. So you will not only add the fat that you have eaten, but you will also convert the carbohydrates to fat. So that's a good question. So I have given talks before that have talked about high insulin levels. When you are a predominantly carbohydrate burning person, your insulin levels go up. If your insulin levels are high, to permit the burning of carbs, and also insulin levels do one more thing, they drive fat into the fat cells. So high insulin levels leads to high blood pressure, high insulin level leads to hunger, high insulin levels lead to reduction in the good cholesterol. You're packing fat into the fat cells, you get obesity, you get strokes. High insulin levels are a cause of dementia. Of course, as the insulin levels keep going up, the pancreas, after a certain period of time, quits. It says, I can't make any more insulin. And then when it can't, you get diabetes, High insulin levels are a very strong driver of cancer and inflammation, in addition to heart disease. So the next slide kind of summarizes all the chronic diseases that you get by being able to burn only carbohydrates and not being able to burn fat. Heart disease, diabetes, dementia, cancers, and strokes. Now, this is something called toxic hunger. So you're eating a bunch of a mixed meal, both fat and carbs and fruits. Your sugar levels go up, your insulin level goes up, and the insulin will convert some of the glucose to glycogen. So it's storing about 100 grams of glycogen. But what does it do to the fat cells? What does insulin do to the fat cells? It packs the fat cells with fat. So in other words, if you're not burning fat, the body does not like to leave fat hanging in the bloodstream. So this is a very important point. A person who's got fat hanging in the bloodstream is not healthy. And the body tries its best not to leave fat hanging in the bloodstream. So what does it do? It drives up the insulin levels so that you can pack the fat into the fat cells, so the smaller fat cells become larger in size. Now the larger fat cells release a hormone called leptin that goes and tells the brain, stop eating. So you would say, hey, the solution is there. You know, my leptin went up, my fat cells increased in size, then I should stop eating. Do we stop eating is the question. If you're on a high carb diet, why do we not stop eating?
We're hungry.
The reason is that insulin prevents the brain from seeing leptin. So in other words, even though your leptin levels are high, when your insulin levels are high, your brain cannot see leptin, and you will not stop eating, and you will have toxic hunger. On the other hand, let's say if somebody has been blessed, is metabolically healthy, their insulin levels are not high, and they're just eating fat, they're not eating carbohydrates at all, they're not eating sugar, their insulin levels don't go up or remain the same. The fat cells increase in size, leptin increases, it comes and tells the brain, stop eating. And then you would be able to better control your hunger. So we find often in our practice when people come in and we advise them to go on a low carb diet, which means get rid of sugar, get rid of grains, get rid of pasta, get rid of sugary fruit, get rid of sweets, eat fat and protein, you can control your hunger a lot better. So we said insulin not only regulates sugar, but it regulates the health of your fat cells, and that is what I want to get with you in detail. And insulin keeps the levels of the triglycerides or fat in your blood low. How does it do that? Here is a diagram of a fat cell. So the fat cell is small in size, about 10 microns, and it can increase in size 20-fold. It can go up to 200 microns. That's about an 8,000-fold increase in its volume. So when the fat cells increase in size, they get stuffed with fat, and there is a limit to the expansion of fat. So in other words, the fat cells can stretch and stretch and stretch. But if you overstretch the fat cells, in other words, you keep driving the fat into the fat cells. And why would you drive fat into the fat cells? Why are you so bad at not being able to maintain the size of your fat cells? It's because we are incapable of burning fat. So if you drive the fat cells beyond their limit of expansion, what happens to these fat cells here? What is happening here? What's happening is that they are dying. They burst, they die, and when something dies, what happens in the body? You get inflammation. What is inflammation? Inflammation is blood cells, white blood cells coming in, causing swelling and redness. I fall off the bike, I get redness and swelling here, that's inflammation. Your fat cells die, you get inflammation in your fat cells that you can check with a biopsy. Now, does that happen to everybody? So that's an important question. So I see plenty of heavy people in my practice, and they are completely healthy. So about 20% of heavy people have normal insulin levels, normal sugar levels, no inflammation markers, are more or less completely healthy. Why is that the case? The reason for them is that when their fat cell is exposed to a large influx of food, instead of the fat cell increasing in size, it divides. It undergoes what is called hyperplasia. It makes quite a few of baby fat cells. So these baby fat cells are pretty happy. They don't require large amounts of insulin. And when you eat more fat, they divide into more baby fat cells, and there is no inflammation. But 80% of us are genetically unlucky in the sense that we make them larger, and at some point they are no longer healthy and they die. So this person who is capable of doing this can even become the size of a sumo wrestler, 600 pounds, but still be healthy because they are making many more baby fat cells. Whereas this thin person who is thin on the outside, fat on the inside, is only expanding the size of their fat cells, that is becoming unhealthy. So here it is shown out here. Fat cells are capable of taking both sugar and fat into them, expanding to the point at which they say no more. So here it says you become insulin resistant if you have overstuffed the fat cells, and that the fat you eat, or the fat that is made from excess carbs, has nowhere to go. It cannot go anywhere. So the body has to increase the insulin levels further to stuff your fat cells in more. So your insulin levels go higher and higher, and higher insulin levels create all kinds of havoc in your body. Hunger, high blood pressure, overweight. Now this is a point at which you are beyond stuffing your fat cells. Okay? So this is, your fat cells have increased in size to a degree that they cannot take fat anymore, and what's happening is that fat is now spilling out of the fat cells. And this is an important point. So when fat spills out of the fat cells, where does it go? So it goes into the bloodstream, it goes into the liver, into the blood vessels, it causes heart disease, and one of the fastest increasing diseases in the United States is fatty liver. So you want to make sure that you're not reaching this point. You want to make sure that you're shrinking your fat cells and not increasing the size of the fat cells. Our body is very smart. It wants to protect the liver. It wants to protect the heart as much as possible. So when you're consuming a lot of calories, especially carbohydrates, the first place that it puts the fat is in the subcutaneous tissue, in the tissue right underneath the skin. When the subcutaneous tissue is full, then it starts putting the fat into the visceral fat, which is called internal belly fat. When that is full and it cannot stuff that anymore, that is when the fat spills over and gets into the liver, into the muscles, and into the blood vessels. So that is what is called ectopic fat, and you don't want to get there. So the question is, what are the biochemical markers of overstuffed fat cells? What can you do to say, hey, do I have overstuffed fat cells? The way you find out is seeing how high your insulin levels are. If your insulin levels are very high, the chances are high that you may have overstuffed fat cells. If you have high triglycerides, we said that the body tries to keep the levels of triglycerides low in the bloodstream. The way it does that is by jacking up insulin levels and pushing the triglycerides into the fat cells. If your good cholesterol to triglyceride ratio is low, that's another finding. If your inflammation markers are high, so in other words, if your fat cells have a lot of inflammation inside them, your inflammation markers will be high. High blood sugar is another way to depict that. Fatty liver is another one. But if you really want to know, you want to do MRI scans, and I'll get into that a little bit. But just a little word for people from India, people from China. This is a gentleman who is doing a lot of work Because what we have found is that in India, normal weight individuals develop type 2 diabetes. India and China have far exceeded the incidence of diabetes compared to the United States. So we have probably 16 to 18%. India has somewhere between 35 and 45% who are diabetic, even though most Indians are thin like me. They're not heavy. Because they have a low personal fat threshold. Their fat cells are not healthy. They don't undergo hyperplasia. They undergo hypertrophy, and when they are overstuffed, they die. And the incidence of fatty liver and heart disease is extremely high in both Chinese and Indian population because they're just not designed genetically to have fat cells that are healthy. So here is to find out if you are like an Indian or like a Chinese, which is called thin on the outside but fat on the inside. And if you do a scan, you can find whether your fat is distributed in the subcutaneous tissue, which is here. This is a healthier situation because there is very little visceral fat, or whether there is a lot more fat in the belly and very little in the viscera. This is MRI scans that are showing that for the same waist circumference, there is different levels of subcutaneous fat and there is different levels of belly fat, visceral fat. So this person has very little visceral fat for the same amount of waist circumference, whereas this person has a lot more visceral fat, about 4.3 liters. So if you want to refine this further, at some point, medicine people will become smart and say, we don't want to do all kinds of tests on you. What we want to do is to find out how much visceral fat you have. And with what I am advising you to do, are you able to drop the visceral fat from here to here? That would be a sign of progress in medicine. Okay, so this is the same thing. This is a normal person. This is a person with subcutaneous fat, not unhealthy. But this is a person who's unhealthy because their subcutaneous fat is not high, but visceral fat is high. Now, I have a few patients in my practice, not uncommon, who are thin and ripped. You know, they are like this man. I mean, he's very muscular, defined musculature. But they have a phenomena which is called lipodystrophy. So a small percentage of population, so you'd say, hey, why does somebody who is extremely thin and athletic, who has no subcutaneous fat, why is he getting into trouble? And some of these individuals have what is called a disorder of fat, lipodystrophy, in which they don't have any subcutaneous fat. They, for whatever reason, they don't put subcutaneous fat. All their fat, this is the pink line showing a thin layer of subcutaneous fat, but the yellow one is showing that their internal organs, the visceral fat, is very high. One of them, so in other words, there is loss of subcutaneous fat reservoir, the fat spills over into the internal organs, and as it spills over, these people become insulin resistant, diabetic, get heart disease, and all kinds of problems. This is a Canadian hurdler. Somebody saw her hurdling and they heard about her and they found that she had high levels of triglycerides, and they called and said, hey, you have the same problem that I have. And sure enough, she turned out to have lipodystrophy, in which there was very minimal subcutaneous fat but a lot of visceral fat. And I'm showing you the two people that got together, and she was able to improve her health because of a spectator who saw and recognized what was happening to her. Now, how do we know that this is true? Can I prove to you that the fat is the one that controls your insulin levels? In other words, if you are capable of packing your fat cells, if you're capable of making small baby fat cells, does that cause health in you? So in other words, there is a mouse model that they make, and this mouse is a mouse model of lipodystrophy. They have very little subcutaneous fat. They have a lot of fat that gets into the liver, into the heart. So no matter what you feed it, they become diabetic, have fatty liver. So they are like this, in the sense that not much subcutaneous fat, but they have visceral fat. So what they did was they took these mice, and in their skin, just underneath the skin, they implanted fat cells, and they connected the fat cells to the blood vessel. And in another group of mice, they did sham surgery. That did not implant anything, just did sham surgery. What did they find? They found that the mice with sham surgery, their insulin levels remained high, whereas the mice that got transplanted with fat, their insulin levels immediately dropped because the fat cells were helping them quite dramatically to improve their insulin resistance. And why have you failed? It's because you eat too much fat? No, that's not the case. You just suck at burning fat. Ted Naiman puts this aptly. You are eating a lot, your fat cells are filled up, your fat spills in, and it damages the liver, and it damages your muscles, and you become insulin resistant. And since you're burning only carbs, your mitochondria get diseased. The mitochondria are part that burn the energy, and you want to have a healthy engine of the cell and not a diseased engine. If you're obese, if you're insulin resistant, if you're a diabetic, you have reduced ability of your mitochondria to burn fuel properly. And so if you want to improve your mitochondria, you would do many things that we advise. So this is a mitochondria. This is the engine of the cell. And what are the fuels that the engine of the cell can burn? We already talked about sugar. We talked about fat. This is protein. Protein is very minimal, so I'm not going to get into that. So you're burning sugar here, or you're burning fat, and that's what you can do. In response to his question, how do you know whether you're burning fat or whether you're burning sugar? So this is what is called a respiratory test. You hook up somebody to a respirator. So if you see the amount of carbon dioxide that I'm releasing out compared to the amount of oxygen that I'm consuming, it is 70 to 100. So in other words, the ratio is 0.7. The way you know whether your mitochondria are healthy or no is by doing what is called a respiratory quotient. On the other hand, if you're just burning carbs, you will release 100 molecules of carbon dioxide to 100 molecules of oxygen, or your RQ would be 1. So the way you find out is the amount of carbon dioxide that you exhale out compared to the amount of oxygen that you absorb. And out here it shows that if you're burning pure sugar, in other words, let's say somebody is so carbohydrate dependent, they're burning no fat, their respiratory quotient is 1. On the other hand, if somebody is very healthy and burning pure fat, they're at 0.7. Now, does that impact anything? Is there any data that tells you that if somebody is burning only carbs versus somebody is burning only sugar, who is healthier? So out here is a group of individuals. This is the bottom 10% who are very good at burning sugar. So that means they suck at burning fat. This is the top 10% that are good at burning fat. And if you go down to 3 years, who is gaining more weight?
Sugar.
The people who are burning sugar. So you can do respiratory quotient at one time and predict that the people who are incapable of burning fat are going to get heavier. So defective burning of fat, fat oxidation, is the most likely explanation as to why people who 3 years later became heavier in that study. So how can you say that somebody is burning more fat? They'll have a lower RQ, which means that they will have lower respiratory quotient, they'll be healthier, they are less obese, they are more insulin sensitive, they have lower risks of diabetes, lower risks of heart disease, lower cancer risks. In other words, being able to burn fat is a marker of health, and this is proven by a few studies. So this is not, I just kind of summarized it, but this is proven by studies. So again, Ted Naiman does a very good job out here. Here is sugar getting into the blood cell, into the cell. Out here is the outer layer of the cell. Here is the engine of the cell, which is the mitochondria. the sugar gets into the mitochondria and it will be burned for energy. What you don't need energy is converted to this molecule called citrate, which then gets converted to malonyl-CoA. So in other words, if you eat a lot of carbohydrates that you cannot store, cannot use for energy, you're going to make a lot of malonyl-CoA. So what happens when you make a lot of malonyl-CoA? This compound is going to go and tell the mitochondria, this is the mitochondria out here, and there is this enzyme that is driving fat into the mitochondria. It's going to say, stop, don't burn fat. Stop, don't burn fat. So one very good way of stopping fat burning is by eating too much carbohydrate, because your body is making fat. Our body is very smart. It's not going to make fat and burn fat at the same time, right? Makes no sense. It's either going to burn fat or make fat. Okay, let's say here is a person who's eating both sugar and carbohydrates, carbohydrates and fat out here. And what you do is you suddenly change the fuel mixture. You suddenly drive up the amount of carbs they are taking by giving them a bunch of glucose. Does the fat burning go down? And you can clearly see that when you do that, fat burning does go down. So I wanted to give you this specific example, which is called carbohydrate hysteresis. How many people understand what the term hysteresis means? So hysteresis means a lag, a period of time in which things don't change. So if you eat a lot of carbohydrate, is there a possibility of losing the capability to burn fat?
Yes.
So that's an important point I want you to understand, because let's say some of you say, I have listened to Dr. Ali, I'm going to stop eating carbohydrates, and they expect to feel immediately better. They are not, because there are adaptations that the body does. The machinery to burn fat gets turned off, and it may take 3 to 4 weeks to turn it back on. And thus some people switching to a low carb diet, they may find it very hard. Why do they find it very hard? So you're not eating any carbs, right? You're eating fat, but you're not doing well. Why are you not doing well?
Because your body's adjusting.
Your body is adjusting. And the reason it's adjusting is that it's not burning any fat. So when it doesn't burn fat, doesn't burn any fat, what does it do? It still has to have that energy, right? What does it do? When it's not burning fat, what does it do? It creates carbs. Where does it create carbs from? Where does it cannibalize the carbs from? It would be great if it did it from the stored fat cells, but you're not burning any fat, so you're not going to get it there. So it's going to burn muscle. It's going to burn muscle. So you will have to figure out how to prevent that from happening. That's why when I say go on a low carb diet, go on fasting, I don't want to eliminate high quality protein from your diet. There is a company that makes obesogenic rat chow. This obesogenic rat chow makes the rat as fat and as quickly as possible. So this is the age of the rat in weeks. Their visceral fat, their body fat is all increasing by about 19 weeks quite dramatically. You can see the increase on this slide out here. They're getting fatter and fatter. If you look at that rat chow, it's got 200 grams of carbs, it's low in protein and sort of moderate in fat, but very high in carbs. What does the standard American diet look like? Very comparable out here. You know, it's like obesogenic rat chow. We not only have carbs, but we have about 120 grams of sugar. So basically what we are doing is we're feeding our population an equivalent of sugar with a few grains along with vegetable oil. So that is the diet that we are having. On the other hand, if you take the information from bodybuilders, we know how to drive the fat cells low quite easily. In other words, how do bodybuilders become so ripped? Why is their fat mass so low? The reason it is low is because they eat a high protein diet, but do they also eat a high fat diet? No. They're not eating a high fat diet. They want to use the protein to prevent muscle loss, But why are they not using a high fat diet? Because they want to burn their fat.
Right.
They want to burn the fat from their own body rather than burn the fat from the fat that they are eating. How can that help a person who is very heavy? Like, let's say somebody is close to body mass index of 40 or greater, 400 pounds, and they want to lose weight rapidly. Would you give them the advice, hey, go home every morning, have bulletproof coffee? Why do we not want them to have a lot of fat? Because you want them to burn their own body fat, right?
Right.
Rather than tapping in on the fat from their diet, they need to tap in on the fat that they have accumulated. Now, why do you want them not to compromise on protein intake? If somebody is very heavy and they are going on a low carb diet, why do you want them not to compromise on protein intake? Because you don't want to lose muscle. And why would you burn muscle? Because the body will convert the protein to sugar. So you want to prevent that. All right. So the human body was not engineered to tolerate this much carbohydrates. Grains is an invention of modern agriculture. Sugar consumption is promoted by industry. It looks like it is summer 12 months round the year. So we have summer all year long, and that's why fruits are high in fructose. They are no longer seasonal. Our ancestors never ate fruit all year long. And the fruit they ate was tart and bitter, was not high in fructose. Vegetable oils are fat that is bad oil because it's inflammatory. All of these things lead to high insulin levels, and high insulin levels make you overeat and destroy satiety. So here is a thin, healthy person. So the question that I have for you guys is that what percentage of thin people are healthy like this? Which means they are healthy, they have low insulin levels, they have a glycogen tank that is empty. In other words, they exercise, they remove all the glycogen from their liver and their muscle. So if they eat carbohydrates by mistake, it doesn't cause any problem because they need to fill their glycogen tank, their insulin level doesn't go up. Their fat cells increase in number rather than increase in size. Their mitochondria are healthy because if you put them onto the respiratory machine, you see that the respiratory quotient is 0.7. They're burning fat. These people can basically eat what they want. This is perhaps about 70 to 80% of thin people, and that's perhaps about 10 to 20% of fat people, like that. On the other hand, if you're thin on the outside, fat on the outside, you're insulin resistant, your insulin levels are high, your glycogen tank is already full or very small, your fat cells increase in size rather than becoming smaller and dividing. The mitochondria are unhealthy, they can't burn fat, they are damaged. These people can eat no carbs, even though they are thin. And that is about probably 20% of thin people. Okay, so how do we treat obesity and insulin resistance? What we say to people is that you're heavy, you're insulin resistant, that's causing high blood pressure, high insulin levels, there is gout, there's heart disease, there's cancer, there's diabetes. You are spilling fat into the bloodstream and putting it into the liver. And what we are telling them is that you don't have enough insulin. You don't have enough insulin. We want to give you more insulin so that you can pack your fat cells more. Your fat cells are not packed enough, let's pack them more, because for a diabetic patient, when you give them insulin or insulin-like agents, they're going to get fatter and heavier. So rather than a diabetic patient taking more insulin, the first thing they need to do is to learn how to burn fat. So this is like that Japanese train. There are people who are hired so that they can shove people into the train, and that's what modern medicine is doing, which is that take a heavy person who's a diabetic and give them more insulin so that they become heavier and sicker. What can you do? Stop eating carbs, insulin levels will decrease, you will start burning fat, you will control your appetite, your blood pressure will come down, fasting will become feasible, and then you exercise to burn more fat. So the three things that we recommend is low carb diet, fasting, and exercise. And this is the state I want you to get to. Go ahead. So can the mitochondria be healed or regenerated once they are damaged? Honestly, I don't know, but I hope that they will.
Yeah.
Now, if you ask me my clinical experience, I have people in their 90s, I have people in their 80s who have lost 30 to 50 pounds, who have stopped using insulin, whose blood sugars have gotten better, they have come off of their blood pressure medicines, they have stopped using walkers, they are walking. So my clinical experience says yes. So
I agree with what you just said.
the healthy person is one who can shrink and expand their fat cells. So when you start eating at noon, you're not eating during that time, you're fasting, you're exercising, this is an 18-hour window, your fat cells are shrinking in size because you're using that fat, you're burning that fat. So fat cycling, going from thin, smaller fat cells to a little heavier fat cells without increasing your insulin level is where we want you to get. So we say start eating like this: cooking lard, butter, eat cream cheese, sour cream, fatty fish, fatty meat, bacon, the dark chicken, as well as ground beef, which is fatty. Now, we have pathways for fat burning. We just talked about food, nutrition.
Di BINARAGA.NET, kami selalu percaya bahwa setiap orang pasti bisa memiliki tubuh yang ideal dan sehat. Dengan subscribe, like, dan share video ini, Anda turut membantu membangun Indonesia sehat dan kuat. Salam jelas fitness, saya JP.